Continuing chapter 13, respiration. Animals are aerobic. They use oxygen to increase the efficiency of pulling fuel molecules apart and using the energy that used to hold them apart to do other things. Mostly they move the energy from glucose to ATP. ATP is a much more usable molecule for all the various things that you got to use it for. But that means that your cells have oxygen requirements. You got to get oxygen to the cells. Now, on the one hand, to get oxygen across the cell membrane, it needs to be wet on the outside. The oxygen needs to get into the fluid and then into the cell. But oxygen does not dissolve in water super well. It's moving by diffusion. If you're using it up, it's moving in. So it isn't really, what I'm talking about is the maximum amount that you can get dissolved in the water. And in aquatic systems, there's a limit to how much oxygen is going to be around you. Yes, dropping oxygen in cells is still going to drive diffusion, but the availability is lower as opposed to the air around me right now, which is about 1/5, a little bit better than 1/5 oxygen, much higher availability to get it from air across a wet surface into the body. So, respiratory surfaces. Need to be thin and they need to be wet. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are moving through a surface. The more surface you have, the more exchange surface you have. Duh. Simple. For gills, basically the same approach. It's what you're basically doing to increase the surface area is what this means here. Oh, that's not going to show up. This will. Looks the same, doesn't it? But in a gill, you wind up with what starts as kind of a flat flap, and then it dips. Is that this starts as a surface and then it dips. And that's invaginations. With a lung, you start with basically a projection and then you grow stuff out of it. Evaginations. You extend kind of tendrils into the air. So it's just a matter of a different way of building it, but you get what looks like very, very similar structures in response to the surroundings. In one case, water, in one case, air. Well, let me put this here. So you're picking up oxygen in the blood. So blood's coming into the gills from the body, so the oxygen levels in the blood are low. So here's the gill. Here's the blood running through it. Here's the water running through it. Water comes this way, blood goes that way. That's your countercurrent. Why? Well, as the blood goes this way, it's picking up oxygen from the water. As the water comes this way, it's losing oxygen to the blood. Out here, the oxygen levels in the water are high, but the blood levels are fairly high too. So you're going to get exchange. The oxygen levels in the blood are dropping as it goes this way, but the levels in the water are dropping, but the levels in the blood are also low because this is the blood coming out of the body. So the comparative concentration, high to low, is retained and you get maximum exchange. Lower levels of oxygen, but way low levels of oxygen. Higher levels of oxygen, high levels of oxygen, but not as high as what's in the water. Later on, we'll see a very similar thing for heat, where if you're trying to retain heat in cold surroundings, is that you have blood going out next to blood coming in, exchanging heat as they go. Countercurrent. Some animals breathe through their outer coverings, cutaneous for skin, but they don't necessarily have skin. They could breathe through their outer coverings. Small animals, again, where the cells are pretty close to the surface. Wet animals is that if you need a wet surface, your skin better be wet in order for this to work. And there may be, circulation where you're picking up oxygen, losing carbon dioxide through the surface. A lot of amphibians do this, where some of them do it with the water, some of them do it with the air. The most common salamanders you find around here, although they're getting very rare now, are cutaneous respirers. Some animals have supplementary air pockets, air sacs. Birds especially, probably at least some of the bird-related dinosaurs, possibly other dinosaurs, not something that fossilizes particularly well. It does double duty, as it can be an additional exchange surface, which is why in birds a lot of the air sacs are connected to the surface, because flying is very energetic. But also a bag full of air is much less weight than even a bag full of tissue fluid. Definitely less weight than a bag full of bone. So you find air sacs in the bones and the bodies, in body cavities, to reduce weight, which in birds was really good for flying. In dinosaurs may have been very good for size and speed. In arthropods, especially insects, you get a tracheal system where there are little valved openings on the outside of the animal, and they lead into air tubes called trachea, like our trachea. They're built the same way so that they don't easily collapse from suction. And these things branch and branch and branch and branch and branch. And in a pretty efficient tracheal system, every cell in the body is somewhere close to a terminal end of one of these little branches that literally have air in them. So it's a way to deliver oxygen to all the cells without depending on a circulation system, and to get carbon dioxide away from the cells. In some situations, the system can be filled or emptied with fluid, because that's a lot of evaporation surface to lose liquid from. And if you don't need the entire system full of air because you're just sitting, then the fluid will fill up, or the system will fill up with fluid, and the exchange surface will just be, where in the tube the top of the fluid is. And then it'll slow down the exchange. But if suddenly you've got to move or you got to fly, is that all that fluid will be sucked right out of the tubes, and the tubes will fill up with air. A lot of oxygen, remember, a lot of oxygen serving the cells. What have we got? Yeah. Okay. We talked about this before when we talked about tissue fluids and water balance. That animals that are in water balance with their surroundings are called osmotic conformers, and a tremendous number of marine animals, especially ones whose relatives didn't evolve on the continents and then come back into the water, are osmotic conformers. So your marine mollusks and your annelids and your your cnidarians, your echinoderms. There's some whole groups that that are only marine because they have not been able to really adapt to much in the way of shifts in osmotic levels. Now, once life evolved in the oceans, there still were continents, there was still weather, there was still rain, there was still erosion and runoff. So there would have been rivers. There would have been places where the tide goes up and down. The moon used to be a lot closer to the earth, so the tides would have been much more extreme. So there would have been tidal zones where the tide would go out and pools would be left behind. And evaporation might happen or rain might happen. And that would change the levels. Where the ocean water and the land water mix, you have non-stable marine environments. The Hudson River has tides all the way up to Troy. Is that the tides come in, and once you get down past about West Point, you're actually in a mixture area where the water starts to get more and more and more salty. There's the push of the water coming down the river that keeps the salt water from coming too far up with the tides. But in areas of extreme drought, it's come up quite a ways. It's actually compromised water intake from the Hudson River when they used to take water out of the Hudson River for places like West Point. And I think even Poughkeepsie was in trouble when there was a really extreme drought back when I was a kid. These are not going to be stable osmotic environments. Animals that live in estuaries, animals that live in places where there's a powerful river outflow. Is that the water out to sea where the Amazon comes out is essentially fresh for 40 or 50 miles out into the ocean because of the push of the water out of the Amazon River kind of pushing its way into the marine environment. So even a marine environment is not always exactly the same osmotically. But these outflow areas, these mixing areas of the tidal zones and flowing fresh water were originally staging areas. Being able to deal with dilute environments, your typical animal response is waterproofing surfaces. You prevent the inflow of water by osmosis by making the surface not permeable to water. Well, once your surface is not permeable to water, to keep it out, you also can keep it in. So tidal zones and estuaries and flowing fresh water were basically the staging areas for the movement of animals from the marine environment to the land environment, getting out of the water and into the air. A number of other adaptations were necessary, but you can't be an osmotic conformer in fresh water. Your cells cannot be completely water, and that's what fresh water is. So you either, the two basic responses that you get in animals. Now, plants had a different adaptation. Remember, plant cells are contained within cell walls, and the inflow of water is not strong enough to break the walls. So you wind up with an even exchange just because in order for water to come in, water's got to leave. So they are not going to get dilute that way. But in animals that don't have containments around their cells, you've got two basic responses. Water pumping and waterproofing. Talked about waterproofing. You can't waterproof your breathing surfaces because they need to be wet. So you're going to have water coming in through those, and your digestive surfaces are going to have water coming in. So even larger animals that are mostly waterproof still need to have some ability to pump water out. Protozoans are always pumping, contractile vacuoles, always pumping the incoming water back out to hold that osmotic balance inside the cells. Now, for some animals, land animals that went back into the water, the exposure to lots and lots of ions in marine environment was a problem, salt. And they're not as impermeable to salt as a lot of marine animals are. You can't let a lot of salt in because you only need so much. So some animals like penguins and saltwater crocodiles and marine iguanas have developed salt glands that actually concentrate the salt and blow it back out to keep it from accumulating to dangerous levels in the tissues. Okay.